Hello, shalom, and welcome to this episode of Congressional Conversations, where we discuss the priorities of New York's Jewish community with members of the New York Congressional Delegation. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. Today, hailing from New York's 8th Congressional District, which encompasses a whole bunch of Brooklyn and a little bit of Queens. We welcome Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, representative, is the chairman of the Democratic Caucus and serves on the House Judiciary Committee and Budget Committee. He is the 5th ranking Democrat in the United States House of Representatives and a longtime friend. Welcome, Congressman Jeffries.
Michael, great to be with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time, I'm sure a busy time to be with us, but I'm happy that we're doing this program while you're in Brooklyn. So it's all local in the hood. Okay, so from a little chuckle to something very, very serious. We have just witnessed another mass killing in Boulder, Colorado, on the heels of the mass killing in Atlanta. 10 were murdered in Boulder and 8 were murdered in Atlanta. President Biden has urged Congress to renew the ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines. What reforms, Congressman, do you want to see in gun control? And you have a number of bills that are already out there. Do they go far enough? There's HR 8 and HR 1446.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly important question. My thoughts and prayers, of course, are with the people of Boulder, Colorado, and the families of the victims, as it remains with the people in and around Metro Atlanta. And the families of those victims who died in that mass tragedy in terms of the targeting of the Asian American-owned spas. We in America have a gun violence problem. It's an epidemic. We have 4% of the world's population, but 40% of the world's guns. And more people die from homicides and suicides related to gun violence in America than in any other developed country in the world. It's not even close when you compare us to countries like Canada or Japan or Israel or England or Germany or France or Australia. And so we have to do something about it in a decisive fashion. Now, the House has passed 2 different bills, the Universal Criminal Background Check legislation, HR 8, as well as the closing of the Charleston loophole. These will be bills that will ensure that before anyone is capable of purchasing a gun at this particular point in time, they will have to go through a criminal background check, no matter how they purchase that weapon. Right now, the loopholes that exist are enormous. That's the gun show loophole and the internet loophole. Those bills are over in the Senate, and we urge the Senate to act expeditiously. I also think it's time for us to consider a assault weapons ban that is consistent with the ban that was first put into place in the 90s and subsequently expired. Because these assault weapons are weapons of war. They're not used to hunt deer. They are used to hunt human beings, often with tragic consequences, as we've seen in Boulder.
Yes, very much. I remember correctly, Congressman Schumer or Senator Schumer was one of the lead voices on the assault rifle ban, and it's just horrible what we're witnessing. And we'll be monitoring this and following it very, very closely. Thank you for your leadership in this regard. I want to turn back to the realities of today here in New York and how we're dealing with a pandemic and COVID relief. In the previous Congress, you worked across the aisle with then member of Congress, Republican Peter King, to secure billions of dollars for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority for the MTA in the CARES Act. in the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. What are your primary goals within that relief bill, as well as whatever might be coming down the road to assist your constituents and the American people?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought so much pain and suffering and death to the people that I represent in the 8th Congressional District, as well as throughout New York City, the state, the country, and the world, is a once-in-a-century crisis. And so we believe it requires a once-in-a-century compassionate, comprehensive, and continuing congressional response. And that is what the American Rescue Plan represents. And so it is broad in nature because the problem is so deep and so broad as it relates to both the public health aspect of the crisis and the economic aspect of the crisis. On the public health side, we secured substantial funding to ensure that every single American who wants a vaccine can get a vaccine. And that is incredibly important because having the vaccine available is one thing. Making sure that the vaccinations take place is what ultimately will allow us to crush this virus and to move beyond the situation that we found ourselves in for the last year or so. At the same time, I'm working hard to make sure that the relief that is provided within the American Rescue Plan actually makes it to the people that I'm privileged to represent. The $1,400 direct payment survival checks, the enhanced relief for people who are suffering with food insecurity, and JCRC does such a tremendous job in making sure that you meet the needs of the people that I represent and New Yorkers all across the city who are food insecure during normal times, let alone in the midst of extraordinary times. We have the enhanced unemployment insurance benefit that was extended through the end of August. We want to make sure that those who still find themselves unemployed, and that's a significant number of people here in New York City, are able to receive that enhanced unemployment insurance so they can make it through to brighter days with respect to the economy. And then lastly, I'll mention one thing that's particularly important is the enhanced and expanded child tax credit that was increased to as much as $3,600 per child for a child that's 6 or under, and will now be allocated beginning in July on a monthly basis. So that could mean $300 per child for a child who's 6 or under, or $250 if you are between the ages of 6 and 17. And so we want to make sure that our constituents can take advantage of that enhanced childhood tax credit, because as you know, it will cut childhood poverty in America in half. More than 5 million children will be lifted out of poverty, many of whom are in the communities I represent.
Right, that's so vitally important. Yes, indeed, we have been working on food insecurity. We have a coalition, an interfaith coalition on food insecurity in our Center for Community Leadership, led so capably by Rabbi Bob Kaplan, whom you know. And we also have another interfaith coalition, interethnic coalition on healthcare disparities, focused in on Brooklyn. In particular, that's where we're starting. So dealing with both of those issues, the healthcare disparities and the food insecurity, what actions can be taken to address those matters that have been exacerbated, those gaps that have been exacerbated by this pandemic?
Well, one of the big challenges that the pandemic has exposed is that we have vulnerable communities that were not doing well pre-pandemic, and then with the magnitude of the crisis that has hit us, have suffered disproportionately harsher consequences. Many low-income communities, a lot of African-American, Caribbean-American immigrant communities, Latino communities as well, just vulnerable communities, elderly people of every race. And I've got a lot of elderly folks in the Brighton Beach portion of the district that I represent, Holocaust survivors, people who are tough, but who the pandemic has hit incredibly hard. So we have to make sure that as we come out of this pandemic, we do exactly what Joe Biden said. We build back better. And we look at the vulnerabilities in terms of lack of access to high quality and affordable health care, the lack of access to healthy food, some of the things, the lack of access to preventative medicine, the lack of access to the ability to actually exercise in a way that reduces some of these frailties that we've seen, like heart disease or diabetes, obesity, the conditions that are enhanced in terms of their adverse consequences by COVID-19, but existed well before COVID-19 hit us. And so I think as we build back better, shoring up and strengthening access to healthcare is going to be incredibly important, as well as the role that diet and exercise, healthy food and activity play in preventing some of these healthcare infirmities is something that I plan to lean in on, and so thankful for the coalition that JCRC is leading and is a part of in that regard.
Thank you very much. And speaking of access to the vaccines is really crucial, particularly for the elderly. So what is it, Congressman, that you've been able to do within your district to ensure that those who want to be vaccinated can actually access the vaccination?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we've worked very closely on with City Hall as well as with the state to make sure that we've got sites that are available and accessible in the community on the ground, in institutions that people within the community trust. And that has been, something that has been a high priority of ours from the beginning. It started with the testing sites that we wanted to make sure were stood up on the ground in places like Coney Island Hospital, as well as the west end of Coney Island, the hospital serving Brighton Beach and Manhattan Beach, as well as the entirety of the Coney Island Peninsula, but also working with houses of worship, faith-based leaders who can provide and disseminate information as to where to get a vaccination and why it's important to get a vaccination. That kind of interfaith coalition has been incredibly important because our faith leaders are trusted messengers. And, we were concerned with a high degree of vaccine skepticism, which in many communities exists, for understandable reasons. In some ways, the African-American community with Tuskegee experiment has dealt with medical experimentation, the Jewish community in horrific ways based on what took place in the midst of the Holocaust has dealt with medical experimentation in horrific ways. And so there's this backdrop that exists that is understandable and would lead to some skepticism amongst folks, whether that's people I represent in Brighton Beach or Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so we've worked hard with trusted messengers to get the message out and make sure that there were accessible sites where people were familiar with those administering the vaccinations in order to make sure that we get the vaccination rates up. And so far, we've been pretty successful.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And again, your efforts in that regard. And let's move to another issue where you have played a pivotal role, a lead role. You were the lead Democratic sponsor of the First Step Act in the 115th Congress, a strong bipartisan criminal justice reform bill. Some say that is the most meaningful criminal justice reform effort in a generation. So where are we today? What are the most pressing issues, Congressman, in criminal justice reform on your agenda? And if you could explain to our viewers what HR 1693 and HR 1924 are, I think that would be helpful in making sure that those who need to know are aware of the role that you're playing.
Well, thank you. And, criminal justice reform has been a labor of love and an issue that has been one that is bipartisan, even in the midst of a very bitterly divided Congress and country in many ways. The First Step Act, of course, was a bipartisan bill that brought together a wide range of individuals and community groups, faith leaders. The Orthodox Jewish community played an important role. The religious right, the Black Baptist Church were all part of a tremendous coalition uh, designed to make sure that we bring about one, prison reform, give people an opportunity to successfully rehabilitate themselves, re-enter society, become productive citizens, and at the same time, save taxpayer dollars, while also striking a blow against the over-criminalization in America that has been brought about, in my view, as a result of the failed war on drugs and the rise in mass incarceration, which began 50 years ago in 1971 when Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. At the time, there were less than 300,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, 2.3 million.
Wow.
Disproportionately Black and Latino, many low income of every race and religion, and a significant number of those people who have been incarcerated over the years in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. They really needed treatment. Instead, they were given a prison cell as part of a lock them up, throw away the key approach that has failed. And so, building upon the First Step Act, the two bills that you referenced, one, the Equal Act, which will bring into line the sentencing that for a long period of time has been a disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which at the outset was 100 to 1 in terms of the difference in sentence that you would receive for the same general offense. But if it was crack cocaine, you would receive 100 times the sentence as compared to powder cocaine. And that had an adverse and disproportionate impact on inner city communities of color, with crack cocaine being the drug of choice in that situation, as opposed to powder cocaine in more affluent communities, even though, Michael, the studies make clear there's no pharmacological difference between the two. I've always wanted to use that word. I can't necessarily spell it, but I know what it means. The body reacts the same exact way scientifically and medically.
How interesting.
To crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That was always the argument as to why there was a difference. That has been disproven decisively. And so we want to bring the sentencing in line with the science and make it retroactive so that people are able to get back into society, reunite with their families and communities, and be productive citizens. So that's the Equal Act, and it's bipartisan in nature. My colleague is Kelly Armstrong, who's a conservative Republican from North Dakota. And I'm a progressive Democrat from the People's Republic of Brooklyn. And so once again, it's a bipartisan effort with a wide degree of the same coalition partners who will be supporting it. And then the other bill is the Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act, which is named after our late great district attorney, Ken Thompson, who was focused on both keeping Brooklyn safe while at the same time making sure that the administration of our laws are fair and that people who had engaged in a minor nonviolent crime in particular paid their debt to society, had an opportunity to get a fresh start. And so the Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act, also bipartisan, Van Taylor, a Republican from Texas, is the sponsor of that bill, along with myself, would give the federal judiciary the opportunity to expunge offenses for low-level nonviolent drug crimes, so that once people have paid their debt, they can get a fresh start at life, be productive citizens, consistent with the Begin Again program that Ken Thompson had when he was our Brooklyn district attorney.
How interesting. I remember Ken Thompson very, very well. very effective as a district attorney. We mourn his passing. Moving on to a related topic, and that's policing reform. What has been your focus with regard to policing reform, and what reforms were included in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, H.R. 1280?
Well, we've come a long way in America. We still have a long way to go. It's a great country, but we know that, systemic racism has been in the soil of America since the founding of the country, and even before, when African Americans first came to the shores of Virginia in 1619. In much the same way, I often point out that anti-Semitism lives in the soil of Europe and has been in the soil for
Indeed.
thousands of years.
Yeah.
And we've got to continue to decisively tackle these issues. The overwhelming majority of police officers that I work with on the ground, I was with several yesterday, are hardworking public servants who are in the community to serve and make life better. But we know, we've seen video after video confirm what many of us have experienced and seen on the ground, that we do have an issue with police violence and police brutality and excessive use of force. And so that is what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is all about. Fundamentally, to try to change the mindset of policing from a warrior mentality, where you have some police officers look at the communities they police as if they are enemy combatants. That's how you get a situation where someone puts a knee to the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We want to change that warrior mentality to a guardian mentality, where the police and the community work closely together to lift up the public safety of everyone. So we have accountability measures that are there. We prohibit certain things like the use of the chokehold, which is un-American and unconscionable and unnecessary, according to major police departments across the country. We have a database that would be national in nature, so that police departments can take a look at the disciplinary records and histories of officers, so that rogue officers are unable to jump from one force to another without that police department knowing the history that existed. That occurred in the Tamir Rice case, the young 12-year-old who was gunned down by a police officer in Cleveland. That was done by a police officer who had a bad disciplinary record from a prior smaller department, was hired by the Cleveland Police Department, who had no visibility into that disciplinary record, with tragic consequences. And lastly, I'll mention we have a national use of force standard, which is designed to encourage police officers to use de-escalation tactics in the first instance, and would authorize deadly force only as a matter of necessary last resort. And many folks remember the Jacob Blake case in Wisconsin, the young man who was shot in the back 7 times as he was walking away unarmed from the police, paralyzed from the waist down, it looks like, for the rest of his life. Had we had a national use of force standard that was implemented in that case, there were several other ways to restrain Jacob Blake without shooting him in the back. And that's the type of policing that we hope to be able to encourage.
Right. I think many of us remember seeing vividly, seeing the video on television or online. It was really gut-wrenching, and I'm glad you're taking leadership in that regard. You're fully aware that prior to the pandemic, there was a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in New York and across the country. The Anti-Defamation League has published data on that, which are quite frightening and very disturbing. What is the reason that you think that over the past number of years there has been a rise in hatred, not only directed against the Jewish community? We talked before about the shootings in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. There's been a lot of anti-Asian criminal activity or criminal activity directed against the Asian community. Very, very upsetting. I've been at rallies. My team have been at rallies to stand together with the Asian community. And there are hate crime bills. I believe that you're co-leading one of them with Representative Krishnamurthy in regard to this rise in hate. So again, why is it happening, and what can we do about it?
Well, it's a very important question, and one of the reasons why we've introduced the legislation with Raja Krishnamurthy, and I commend you on getting the pronunciation exactly right the first time. That was very impressive. And Raja, when he actually ran the first time, had a whole campaign based on the pronouncement of his last name. So that's very
Right,
impressive, Michael.
Jeffries and Miller are easy.
That's right. But the legislation is designed, one, to create a commission to look at the rise and also understand ways in which we can document it, better report it, as a way of allowing for the data to then drive the resources to crush the rise in hatred and anti-Semitism, anti-Asian violence, racism, xenophobia, and it's been extraordinary in nature. It would be too simplistic an explanation for me to attribute it all to the most recent president of the United States of America, though he played a role in sort of sanctioning hate from the highest office in the land, and perhaps empowering others who were in hiding to come out, and in some ways radicalizing them to be able to act on their biases. But I don't put it all on him. He was a symptom as well, and took advantage of what he saw to access political power, in my view. But certainly that plays a part in what we've seen. But I think intolerance is something that we have to intentionally lean into crushing, because it's always existed. And we talked about anti-Semitism being in the soil of Europe, making its way over to America, racism being in the soil of America throughout our founding, great country founded on high ideals, but also the sin of slavery and, Native American genocide taking place at the same time. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about continuing to march toward a more perfect union. And there's a through line when you look at what took place in Mother Emanuel Church,
Yes.
The targeting of African American worshipers,
Yes.
in a Black church, and then the Tree of Life Synagogue, and the targeting of the Jewish community at a synagogue in the Pittsburgh area. And then the mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, the targeting of a predominantly Latino community in a border town in Texas. And then most recently in Atlanta, the targeting, it appears, of the Asian American community, and certainly 6 of the 8 victims being Asian American women. It's clear to me that this was unfortunately an instance of anti-Asian violence. We can't ignore that pattern. And certainly in several of those instances, there was a thread of white supremacy that had been in the dark corners of the internet that had been brought to life in several ways. And the targeting of certain communities, the Jewish community, African American community, immigrant community, runs through the thread of these white supremacist organizations, as the FBI has documented for us. And we need to give the FBI the resources to deal with this as well.
Right. Let's shift now to a second issue of concern to the Jewish community. I view these 2 issues as threshold issues for us. One of them is combating anti-Semitism. The other one is being supportive of Israel. I'm very proud to have accompanied you to Israel on your first trip when you were still a New York State Assembly member, a very memorable trip that we took together with other members of the New York State Assembly. What are some of your fondest memories of your time in Israel? And you've been back since. What would you tell someone who criticized trips to Such as the ones that JCRC runs, Are any of those criticisms valid?
In my view, the criticisms are not valid whatsoever. The trip that I took with JCRC was incredibly educational. It was a wonderful opportunity to get to know some of my colleagues as well in the state assembly as part of an educational journey to Israel. Perhaps one of my most memorable experiences was when we went to Sderot.
Hmm.
It was at a time when rockets were flying from Gaza. And I remember we were sitting around a conference table, and I think a folder was passed around that we were required to sign. We took a look at it, and it was appropriately a waiver of liability form.
I remember.
And I realized that things were serious, but it was important because it brought to life, we're going to Sderot to spend a day or so there. There are people who are living under these conditions each and every day.
Right.
And it helped to really crystallize the need at the time for, the expansion of what would become known as the Iron Dome
Yes.
batteries that, now have pretty robust coverage throughout Israel's geographic territory, but that was not the case back then. I think on subsequent trips, getting to be familiar with the terrain and the fact that Israel has such a narrow waistband where the majority of its population is really and infrastructure is located in and around Jerusalem and in and around Tel Aviv.
Hmm.
Really, I think you can't, unless you experience it on the ground,
Yes.
you don't fully get uh, a window of visibility into the nature of Israel's security concerns
Hmm.
and why it remains so vulnerable in a tough neighborhood,
Yes.
one of the toughest in the world, which you can look at a map, but to be on the ground and experience it, and whether that's, the nuclear threat from Iran or chaos in Syria, Hamas in Gaza, a tough situation in the Sinai to the south, Hezbollah to the north. I mean, that's a tough neighborhood. I grew up in Crown Heights in the middle of the crack cocaine epidemic. I know from tough neighborhoods, Israel lives in one.
Right.
And I think, but being on the ground and experiencing it in several ways, beginning with that first trip, I think is so incredibly important because Israel is one of our closest allies in the world, most important in
Yes.
the Middle East, and that's anchored in both our values and in the security interests that are shared.
Right. You have displayed over the course of this conversation and certainly through your career on Capitol Hill, your desire to be bipartisan and to reach across the aisle. What can be done to ensure that the Israel issue be as bipartisan as it possibly can be?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to keep Israel a bipartisan issue. There was a rough road over the last few years, but we've made it through and gotten to a place where I think we've stayed the course, which is incredibly important because, as I've said to many people, presidents come, presidents go, congressional majorities come, congressional majorities go, and we've got to keep the issue of Israel one that relates to the relationship between the United States and Israel, not Netanyahu and Trump or Benny Gantz and Joe Biden or blue and white, or Labor and the Democratic Party or Likud and the Republican Party, or whatever the progressive umbrella or the centrist umbrella is at the moment. In Israel, it's got to be between Israel and the United States.
Yes.
And so I think anchoring it in that regard is important. And most recently, I was proud to be part of a bipartisan letter, 75 Democrats, 75 Republicans, that sent a letter to President Biden and to the Secretary of State talking about the importance of arriving at, an agreement that is strong and robust and shields the world from Iran becoming nuclear capable and at the same time deals with all of the other malignancies of Iran in terms of its ballistic missile capability, the exportation of terror to other parts of the region, obviously the targeting of our allies like Israel and the Gulf states and things of that nature. And so I think it set a good tone. The administration had a very good response to it. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to deal with all of the challenges connected to Israel and the Middle East, anchored in that special relationship between the United States and Israel in a bipartisan way. And, you know, that includes building upon the Abraham Accords and advancing the cause of peace.
Thank you. One last question for you, and thank you for your time. We've talked about inter, one party to the other party. What about intra within the party? As chairman of the Democratic Caucus, can you expand a little bit about the Democratic Party's breadth and how you would work to ensure the party includes a wide tent, but still be moored in its basic values, central values?
Yeah, well, I think that we are an incredibly diverse caucus and an incredibly diverse party. In terms of the House Democratic Caucus, we value that diversity. It's racial, it's religious, it's gender, it's sexual orientation, it's regional, it's ideology. From very centrist members, moderate members, pragmatically progressive members, to super progressive members, and it's also anchored in life experience as well. But I think the key has been for us to understand that if we're going to be able to govern successfully, we have to be able to find the highest common denominator. And that is really helped by the presence of a president like Joe Biden and a vice president like Kamala Harris, who want to move forward in a bold way, in a progressive way, but also in a practical way to accomplish big things on behalf of the American people, but to do it in a way that brings people together as opposed to divides folks, which was the pathway, in my humble opinion, unfortunately, in too many instances of the prior administration. And so I think Joe Biden is the leader of the Democratic Party. He's clear who he is. As Jim Clyburn says, we know Joe, and Joe knows us. And that stands for not just the African-American community, but for the country. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons why we've been able to, I think, remain unified under his lead. And we serve as partners with him. And so thankful to have a Senate Democratic majority led by not just a New Yorker, but a Brooklynite and a proud Brooklynite, Leader Chuck Schumer, who's also doing an extraordinary job of holding together a Senate Democratic caucus that ranges from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin and all points in between. Not an easy job, but as a Brooklynite, he can handle it.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, for spending so much time with us and answering these questions so amply. Is there a last word that you'd like to share with us, particularly as we're about to celebrate Passover in the Jewish community, and our Christian brothers and sisters will be celebrating Easter?
Well, as we enter this, holiday season, I just wish everyone a happy Passover, and certainly look forward to being out in the community as we prepare to make sure that every family has the access to the traditional Passover food and meal to celebrate the holiday appropriately. It's an honor and a privilege of my life, really, just to serve such an incredibly diverse district, one of the most Jewish districts in the country, a fact that I tout often in Washington and across the country, because I'm proud of the fact that I have the opportunity to serve a community that has been so important to Brooklyn, to the city of New York, and to the nation.
Thank you. And I am honored and privileged to call you a friend and to have a longstanding relationship with you. You have done so much, not only for the district, but for the state and for the country, as well as enhancing the relationship between the state of Israel and the United States, and the state of Israel and New York. So once again, my warmest thanks to you and gratitude for joining us. To our audience, we thank you for watching. And to learn more about the issues we discussed today, you can check out JCRC-NY's 2021 Focus on Communal Priorities, which can be found on our website, jcrcny.org. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Congressional Conversations. Thank you all very much, everybody. Goodbye and shalom.
Thank you. Shalom.